Hello, everyone, and welcome to our next lecture. With this lecture, we are going to be beginning our history unit. So, we're going to be looking at theater from everything from the beginnings in Greek Roman theater through the Middle Ages, the Renaissance, all the way up to the 21st century. In addition, we will also take some time to look at examples of non Western theater. Specifically, we'll look at theater from India, China, and Japan during this entire unit. So, we have a lot of information to cover during this unit, and especially in this lecture. And you should note we'll also be reading two plays during this unit. So, if you have not begun Antigone, you need to read it. It is on Canvas and provided to you. And you need to have that read in advance of the next lecture. The second play we'll be reading in this unit is Emperor of the Moon by Aphra Behn. And you're reading two versions. You're reading the original version, and you're also reading a contemporary, updated, adapted version so that you can compare the two and see how language or situations or events within them have been modified from the original 17th century to the 21st century. So, those plays are also provided to you on Canvas. So, let's go ahead and get started. As we know, from what we've talked about with theater having its beginnings in ritual, we need to also understand that theater involves essentially storytelling. As a director, one of the things I want to do is always think about what the story is that I'm trying to tell to an audience. What do I want the receivers to gain from the story that they are going to experience? Theater, of course, also involves costuming, it involves imitation, and it has used these elements since its beginning. So, initially, what we should understand is that religious activities and rituals became formal, repeated ceremonies that evolved into theater. They used masks, they used costuming, and these rituals transformed into theatrical events in Greece, the first place in Western civilization that we encountered drama. And in fact, in Greece, they even held contests among the playwrights who would present their work in order to determine what work was the best. Thespis is credited with being the very first person to step out from the chorus and portray a character. Thus, the term thespian is used to mean a stage performer. Now, what we should keep in mind is because theater evolves from religious activities and rituals, essentially a group of people were singing or chanting together, so they functioned as a unit, as a chorus. Thus, when we have that first individual stepping away from the chorus and speaking as an individual, that's when we describe that individual, Thespis, to be the first stage performer. So let's begin by taking a look at some of the origins in Greece. What is important for us to understand is that the golden age of Greece is referred to as the classical period, and it began approximately in the 5th century BCE, before the Common Era. This was an age of politics, philosophy, science, mathematics, and the arts. During this time, celebrations of the god Dionysus are generally credited with the start of theater. And during these celebrations, dithyrambs, which were hymns that were sung and included dancing, were performed in celebration of Dionysus by a chorus of approximately 50 men. Again, we're talking about men being the performers here. So you have dithyrambs as these hymns, these songs that also had dancing. But Dionysus and the celebration of Dionysus is where we look to theater for its origins in Western culture. Aristotle considered dithyrambs to be the origin of tragedy and of phallic songs. Phallic songs being those that celebrated male sexual potency. And if we look at this, the dithyrambs began tragedy. The phallic songs are the origin of comedy. So I want to make that clear. Dithyrambs are not an origin to phallic songs. Dithyrambs and phallic songs are two separate things. The dithyrambs begin tragedy, according to Aristotle. The phallic songs begin comedy, according to Aristotle. Okay? So I hope I clarified that, because I didn't read that initially as carefully as I should have. The chorus, then, in Greek theater, was the group of performers who sang and danced and occasionally participated in the action. Usually, a chorus functions as commentators on the action. As you read the play Antigone by Sophocles, I want you to think about the fact that the chorus is commentating on the action of the play. That's number one. Number two, because the Greeks were very literal in their staging. Remember, they had no artificial light. They were presenting these in outdoor performance spaces. So therefore, if they're in outdoor performance spaces, the only action they believed to be shown was that action that occurred outdoors within the play. So the chorus not only comments on the action, but they inform the audience about what occurred inside the building that we could not see. So when you think about Antigone, the chorus is commenting on the action that takes place outside and informs us of the action that takes place inside that we don't actually get to see. Now, Greek theater was, number one, associated with its society's polytheistic religious practices. Thus, the idea of gods and the many gods come into play in almost every single example of their tragedies and their comedies. Number two, it was performed on special occasions and in very specific places. So Athens, the city of Dionysia, rural Dionysia, and Linnea were just some examples of the specific places where theater was performed. So it's not just like theater could be performed everywhere. There had to be a reason and a location for it. Third, Greek theater was choral. So that means it's very similar to this idea of religious ritual and of singing and of dancing and of having a group of individuals who bring that song and dance together. So it's a group of individuals telling a story simultaneously. Number four, Greek theater was competitive. Awards were given to playwrights and to performers. There were rules for judging the competition, for determining eligibility, for ultimately choosing the winners. So rules governed these competitions. And probably the most important thing is the fact that Greek theater was subsidized. So it was produced by the city-states and by wealthy citizens who sponsored the competitors, because in sponsoring the competitors, they themselves would gain wealth, recognition, and ultimately fame. So if we look at examples of some types of Greek costuming, what I'm showing you are three different types of clothing that Greek men wore. And these would also be used during the play productions to symbolize the different types of characters. The image here on the left is called a chiton. It is a tunic that is belted at the waist, and essentially it is a rectangular piece of material, and it wraps around the body to be belted. and is ultimately pinned, usually pinned on the shoulder. Third, we have a hammation. A hammation is a mantle that is draped around the right shoulder. Now, I know this statue has it draped on the left shoulder, but in reality, it's usually draped around the right shoulder. So, whereas the chiton might be pinned at the shoulder in order to hold it together, so we wrap it around the body, pin it, and belt it, and it's usually above the knee. The hammation is a much larger piece of fabric, also usually rectangular, or it might be semicircular. And it is draped. So this piece drapes up over the shoulder, comes around, and drapes back. Then on the right, we see a chlamys. A chlamys is a very short cloak, generally going just below the hips. It is pinned on the shoulder, and here, yes, you see how it is pinned on the right shoulder. The right arm is essentially bare. So it's just a cloak that would generally be worn over something. So perhaps you might wear the chlamys over a chiton. Now, one thing I want to make very, very clear here is, especially if you happen to belong to a Greek fraternity or sorority, one thing that occurs is the idea of toga parties. And if you have ever watched the film Animal House from the late 1970s, they talk about toga parties, all of this. The irony here would be that fraternities and sororities have their origins in Greek life, and they are referred to Greek life on universities. Togas, however, are not Greek. They are Roman. And so the irony is that when we think about stereotypical ideas of clothing associated with Greeks and what films have shown us, and they talk about togas, number one, a toga is Roman, it's not Greek. And number two, a toga is actually more similar to a chlamys in that a toga is always worn over something else. So a toga would always be worn over, essentially, a tunic of some type, so like a big shirt. Whereas when we look at these, the chiton, the hammation, and the chlamys, the hammation and the chiton themselves are generally just worn as they are. And you might put the chlamys on top of a chiton if you are going outdoors and it's raining or something of that nature. Okay? So, I just want you to think about that. And if any of you, whether you are Greek or not, happen to ever be invited to a toga party, consider telling them that toga is Roman, not Greek, and they should maybe have a chiton party instead, or a hammation. Or if you are a woman, say that you're going to wear peplos, and look that up. That's also Greek. Okay? Now, moving on. The city of Dionysia. In the city of Dionysia, festivals to honor the god Dionysus began incorporating tragedy plays approximately 534 BCE and comedy plays about 487 BCE. 3 days of tragedies with 5 comedies would be performed as part of the festival. Now, this festival also included satyr plays. Now, satyr plays is the word satyr is the origin of the word satire. So satyr plays were satires of Greek history and mythology with a chorus comprised of half-man, half-goat performers. So the half-man, half-goat is what we know today to be a satyr. And so all the performers would be costumed as a half-man, half-goat. And they would satirically comment on their own Greek history and their own Greek mythology, thus gives us the origin for what we call satire today, which is the satyr play. So, the festival honoring Dionysus, you would have 3 days of tragedies. So, a playwright would come to the competition with 3 tragic plays. And one play would be performed each day as part of this competition. Now, over the course of those 3 days, as these tragic playwrights were competing, 5 comedies would have also been chosen that would be ultimately performed. So they were mostly watching tragedies, and the tragedies were generally what was in competition, but comedies were also being performed. Now, the dramas were chosen months in advance, and the playwrights essentially functioned as the directors. They wrote, they directed, they chose and cast the actors, and they oversaw the production. And awards would be given for the best plays after everything was completed, so at the end of the festival. Greek myths generally acted as the foundation for the plays that were written in order to explain human relationships and life. Now, we're going to take a look at Greek tragedy playwrights, and we're going to consider 3 of the most important tragedy playwrights. Then we'll take a look at Greek comedy playwrights. So first we're going to consider Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides. Aeschylus is the first tragic playwright to reduce the chorus from 50 to 12 men. Okay, so keep in mind that prior to this, we essentially had a chorus of 50. He's reduced it down to 12. He then increased the cast to either 2 or 3 actors. Now, these 2 or 3 actors would play multiple characters, changing their masks. Aeschylus' plays were generally about noble families and big themes. And he's known for his Oresteia trilogy. Now, keep in mind, I said at the Festival of Dionysus, the playwrights would present 3 tragic plays over 3 days. So that means they would bring a trilogy of plays, where there is usually something in common between all of them. Aeschylus has one trilogy that is called the Oresteia. It's composed of the 3 plays Agamemnon, the Libation Bearers, and the Eumenides. The Eumenides has a subtitle, or is also known as the Furies. This is probably the most well-known Oresteia of all of the golden age of Greek theater. Aeschylus himself won the festival 13 times. Now, to tell you a little bit about his plays, let's talk about Agamemnon. Agamemnon is a Trojan War hero who returns home to be murdered by his wife, Clytemnestra, and the man that she's having an affair with. And Clytemnestra is then murdered by her own children, Electra and Orestes. So that's what happens in Agamemnon. The Libation Bearers and the Eumenides then continue within the trilogy to tell stories about Electra and Orestes. Now, the characters of Electra and Orestes have also been written about by other Greek playwrights. A trilogy refers to 3 tragedies that were written to function as a single unit and were performed at the festival. So that Oresteia trilogy would be presented over 3 days. Agamemnon, the first day, Libation Bearers, the second day, the Eumenides, the third day. And so it's like reading a series of books. So take Harry Potter and looking at the first 3 novels, and you are reading them in succession, or they are being performed in succession. That's what was occurring here. So as a trilogy, as a single unit, they comprised an entire story. The second Greek playwright we're going to look at is Sophocles. Sophocles generally had a chorus of about 15, and he used 3 actors who themselves wore different masks in order to play multiple characters. It's believed that Sophocles wrote more than 100 plays, that he won the festival 18 times. But of those 100 plays that he wrote, only 7 survive today, with Oedipus Rex, Electra, and Antigone, Antigone being the one you're reading, considered to be his most well-known. Sophocles himself is considered, especially by Aristotle, to be the epitome of Greek dramatic playwrights. Although Aeschylus came before Sophocles, Sophocles is considered to be the best example of a tragic playwright and produced the best examples of tragic plays. Then our third playwright is Euripides. Euripides developed a sympathetic female character within all of his plays. And Euripides actually included elements of realism. Unlike Sophocles and Aeschylus, Euripides was skeptical of the gods and of their influence, and was essentially considered to be a rebel. He is most well known for the play Medea, about the mental anguish of the title female character and what she experiences. In total, when we're talking about Aeschylus, Sophocles, and Euripides combined, only 31 of their plays have survived from the Golden Age to today. Now let's talk about the Greek tragedy plot pattern. Typically, when you look at the play and you break it down to identify the pattern, and you can see this with Antigone, it begins with an opening scene, then the chorus comes into play. Then there's an episode between characters. We would refer to that as being a scene. Then we get the first choral song, so there's actually something that would be sung. And then there is an alternating pattern between episodes and choral songs until we get to the final episode. So essentially, an opening scene sets the stage. A chorus comes in and comments. We have the first scene or the first episode. Then the first choral song comments on what we've just witnessed and about what is taking place inside the building that we can't see. Then we get our second episode, our second scene, and then another choral song. And they alternate back and forth between each other until we get to the final episode, and essentially then the exit of all the characters in the chorus. Now the chorus, number one, reacted the way the audience might. So they reacted to the episodes and to the scenes the way the audience might in order to essentially inform the audience how they should react. Number two, they gave background information that was necessary in order to understand the plot. So as you read Antigone, consider what the chorus says as being very important, telling you what you need to know to understand the entire story. Number three, the chorus provides a balance between the behaviors of the main characters because you have a protagonist and an antagonist. And so the chorus balances their behaviors. And we'll discuss the plot of the play Antigone in great detail during our next two lectures. Now let's talk about Greek comedy. Greek comedy is divided. We have Old Comedy, which was directed at social, political, and cultural conditions or specific individuals, versus New Comedy that dealt with romantic and domestic situations. So New Comedy existed approximately 448 to 380 BCE. So we're looking at a period of about 70 years, give or take. Old Comedy was essentially prior to that, prior to 448. Aristophanes is considered to be the greatest comic Greek playwright. He wrote plays that we would describe today as being biting, body satires. These include plays such as Lysistrata, The Birds, The Frogs, The Clouds. The Birds as a play is about um, a bird kingdom in the sky and how two bumbling guys on Earth in Greece find their way up to the kingdom of the birds and eventually con the birds into trying to come down and take control of things. Lysistrata is a play that actually is about condemning war by women. And so the women, therefore, go on strike and refuse to have sex with the men until they stop fighting. So Lysistrata is a play about women not having sex with men in order to get the men to stop going to war. I considered having us read Lysistrata instead of Antigone, but I feel that Antigone presents a stronger female character. However, I will fully admit I'm torn because you still have men in both instances writing plays with female characters. So they're attempting to give a woman a voice. But in reality, you have to acknowledge the fact that the only performers were male. So even the women were played by men. So you have a male, Aristophanes, writing a comedic play, putting women at the forefront, and women using sex to get what they want, which is the end of war. But in reality, those words are being spoken by a man playing a woman. So it's a man playing a woman who ultimately says the lines about trying to use sex to achieve a goal. Because of that, I personally, although I like to play Lysistrata, and there are other reasons why I chose not to use it, but that was the primary reason why I didn't want to go with Lysistrata, um, and go instead with Antigone. Menander is another Greek comedic playwright, and within his plays, he specifically mocked domestic life. His play, The Curmudgeon, is believed to be the only fully intact play of his that we have today. Now, let's go across the Mediterranean to Roman theater. Roman theater is known for comedy, not tragedies, and for other forms of entertainment. Greek theater was typically considered to be very intellectual, or what we might say today as being high-minded. Roman theater was not high-minded. It was about comedy, gladiator fights. If you think about the Colosseum, having animals there and fighting with them, Roman theater was probably more brutal, as well as being more bawdy than Greek theater. The Ludi Romani is the first Roman festival dedicated to the Roman god Jupiter that included theater. And this began approximately 240 BCE. So we have Greek theater in existence for at least 2 centuries prior to theater being included in a Roman festival. Now, around this time, what we saw were short, sexually suggestive skits being developed in Roman entertainment. Pantomime, that included gymnastics, juggling, songs, and dances, were also developed and were performed either by a single dancer or by a chorus. So this idea of body humor and of sexually suggestive skits, or in some instances, sexually expressive skits, were significant to Roman theater. If you've ever watched the television show Spartacus, you will see within that series the significance that sexual activity played in Greek entertainment, or excuse me, in Roman entertainment and in Roman life, and how much more open in many instances it might have been. Roman mime, however, unlike Greek performances, did include women as performers. And it is the only theater at that time that included women. Mime performers did not wear masks, and their success depended on being handsome and beautiful or grotesque and ugly. So, what that means is that the Roman mime performers, male and female, were successful the more handsome or beautiful they were successful the more grotesque and ugly they were, based upon the type of mime that they did. And they created and performed mime or mimes, pantomimes, based upon their physical appearance. So they would use their beauty or their ugliness, as they determined it, to an advantage, so to speak, in their pantomimes. We probably don't understand that today. However, I do want you to keep in mind that the idea of handsomeness and beauty are still extremely prevalent in our culture and in cultures around the world. Just look at social media. Look at who endorses products on YouTube, who are social influencers. And you will know that people today, just as in Rome, attempt to use their beauty, their physical looks, in order to entice others. Now, when we talk about Roman playwrights, we have to begin by talking about Plautus. Plautus wrote comedies based on Greece's new comedy, not old comedy, but new comedy. And he specifically wrote about the challenges of romance. He wrote farces that had stock characters. His play Monogamy actually influenced Shakespeare's plays Comedy of Errors, and Pot of Gold influenced Moliere's play The Miser. So Monogamy and Pot of Gold are both plays written by Plautus. These two plays ultimately influenced, during the Renaissance, the English playwright of William Shakespeare and the French playwright Moliere. Terence is a Roman playwright who had a more literary style. His play Phormio uses verbal wit, not the farce and the slapstick of Plautus. So where Plautus would have physical comedy involved, and we would look at that today as being farce, Terence based his on verbal wit, which today we might think of as comedy of manners or comedy of ideas. Seneca is a Roman playwright that wrote tragedies, and in his plays, he emphasized on-stage violence that had stabbings, murders, and suicides. Essentially, what you should know is that Seneca's plays were probably not staged. They were intended to be read rather than staged. And his plays influenced Shakespeare in the writing of Hamlet. So I want you to think about the fact that Shakespeare is truly getting inspiration from playwrights who wrote more than 1,500 years before he even lived. Here are 5 characteristics of Seneca's plays. Number 1, there's a chorus. That should be fairly familiar. Number 2, the protagonist of the story has a single passion that drives the action. Number 3, Seneca always has minor characters that are messengers or ghosts. Do you see where this comes into play with Hamlet? You have messengers and ghosts in Hamlet. You have Hamlet with a single desire to determine what happened to his father. Number 4, rhetorical language. What is more rhetorical than Hamlet's to be or not to be? That is the question. And number 5, scenes of violence and gore. And of course, there's violence and death in Hamlet. So, with these characteristics, you should be able to see how Shakespeare is directly influenced by Seneca and his work. Now, if we talk about production, here is a ground plan of a typical Roman theater. Okay, so we have the seating area here, the amphitheater, the orchestra, the stage, and the scene building, or in Greek, that would be called the skene. Horace wrote a theory of theater that is titled Ars Poetica. And Horace stated that tragedy should deal with royalty, but comedy should depict common people. Drama should not simply entertain, but also teach a lesson. Like Greek theater, Roman theater had the semicircular sloped seating area, the orchestra, and the stage house. Okay, so Horace, in writing Ars Poetica, is Roman. Tragedy is about royalty, comedy is about common people, and drama itself needs to entertain and teach a lesson. Now, here are some other forms of entertainment venues, so to speak. So, Roman theater also included chariot racing, equestrian performances, acrobatics, wrestling, prize fighting, and gladiatorial combats. Spectacle overshadowed theater. So, if you recall from Aristotle's Poetics, spectacle is one of the 6 defining characteristics of a tragedy, according to Aristotle. In Roman theater, spectacle is the most important thing about entertainment and about theater. So the gladiator fighting, the equestrian races, the chariot races, the acrobatics, the spectacle of what occurs is what's important. Other examples of Roman theater are called namachies. Now, namachies were special arenas that were built and filled with water where slaves on ships fought until all hands were killed. In fact, the Roman Colosseum, which we typically think about in terms of gladiator fights or gladiators fighting lions or tigers as well as each other, the Roman Colosseum also was designed so that it could be filled with water up to a certain level. And ships would be brought in and they would reenact battle scenes until all the slaves on the ships were killed. In fact, the Battle of Carthage is one prime example that would be reenacted in the Colosseum on ships. And they used slaves as the performers. Keep in mind what I said earlier. Roman theater is body. Probably a better description to say it is to describe it as brutal. They did not value human life unless you were wealthy and had money. It was acceptable for them to own and trade people. And if you've watched the television series Spartacus, you know that the character Spartacus, like the other gladiators, were owned and were specifically being trained to fight against each other in the arenas. And so with namachies, while they're on water and ships, and we think of that in terms of spectacle, that's significant, that's huge. We probably can't imagine it. The worst part about this is the human life that was lost and who those lives were. Roman theater gradually came to an end because Christianity grew. So during the Common Era, with the advent and growth of Christianity, the church viewed the sexual content, the evil characters, the brutality as immoral. The church also believed that theater had connections to pagan religions, and these pagan religions were frowned upon by Christians. Thus, because of the church's influence, theater was banned in 475 CE. So, after approximately 400 years of Christianity's origins, theater comes to an end because it's considered to be immoral. And we would agree the brutality, the violence is immoral. But also the nature of evil characters as antagonists, the sexual content, all of that. So whereas today, nearly any topic or subject is viable in film or theater, we have to realize that all of this comes to an end in 475, Common Era. And theater is banned for nearly 1,000 years as a result of this. And so that then brings us to medieval theater, the Middle Ages. Medieval theater is going to be that theater that exists between the time of theater in Rome, coming to an end in 475, and the Renaissance beginning in, let's say, the 16th, 17th century. Okay? So, the time period here is approximately 500 to 1500 Common Era. Theater is banned. Okay? We just learned about that. Theater for entertainment purposes is not going to be publicly developed or used. However, what occurs is that theater begins to grow out of a need to educate people about Christian principles according to what the church wants them to understand. And it begins mainly due to the works of HROSWITHA and ETHELWOLD. Now, what begins to be developed are called liturgical dramas. And these are biblical dramas in Latin that were acted as small segments during church services. So keep in mind that Christianity is growing and spreading, but church services are still in Latin. So they are not in vernacular language, not in the language of the people in each of the various areas. So there's a need to teach these biblical dramas, to teach the Bible stories to people. And so liturgical dramas then were developed and used during church services as small portions, small segments to teach the Bible stories. What's interesting to keep in mind here is that this was not seen as theater, since theater itself had been banned. Vernacular dramas then had to be developed using the everyday language of the people, and these would be performed in town squares. So you have liturgical dramas that would be performed in church during services. Vernacular dramas then would be performed in town squares in the language of the people, but they still told religious stories. There were three types then of plays that were developed during the medieval period. And I want you to think of them as the three M's: morality, mystery, and miracle. Morality plays were stories that were specifically used to teach right from wrong, in which the characters personified abstract qualities. The play Everyman, which was written approximately 1500 CE, is an allegorical play. It uses allegorical characters and religious themes to teach moral lessons. Every character in that play doesn't have a typical name like we think of, but is named according to a moral, so that it is an allegorical representation of something else. Mystery plays were those that were developed based upon reenacting Bible stories. So in England, we have the play The Second Shepherd's Play, which was written around the late 14th century, so during the 1300s. And during this play, the character Mac steals a sheep from three shepherds who happen to be going to visit the Christ child. Mac's wife, Gill, then pretends that this sheep is her newborn child. The shepherds realize eventually it's the sheep and toss it in a blanket. And later, they go to see the Christ child when an angel tells them to. The Second Shepherd's Play is an episodic play example. The third type of medieval play is the miracle play. And the miracle play was developed to teach people about the lives of saints. So morality plays taught right from wrong, mystery plays taught Bible stories, and miracle plays enacted the lives of saints and taught about the lives of saints. HROSWITHA of Gandersheim then lived about 932 to 1002 Common Era. And HROSWITHA is a nun of the Benedictine Abbey. HROSWITHA wrote 6 morality plays based on the raunchy comedies of Terence that were written in Latin. What's unusual about HROSWITHA is she is considered to be the first female dramatist that we know about. And looking at the time period, you should note she's writing approximately 500 years after plays in Rome have been banned. Secondly, she is considered to be the first post-classical playwright after the ones of Greece and Rome. And third, she was a very educated woman. Unusual at the time, but because she's a Benedictine nun, we would expect that she would have some education. She knew how to read and write. She especially knew Latin, which was very unusual. And the Abbey most likely would not have allowed performances of her works because of its strictness. Terence provided HROSWITHA the inspiration ideas regarding how to write a play. And as a nun, her Roman Catholic tradition led her to write moral plays, or essentially morality plays, plays about right and wrong. Ethelwold of Winchester, living about 904, 909, there's arguments over when he was born, to about 984 Common Era, again, about the same time, a little earlier, he was born a little earlier than HROSWITHA, is a bishop of Winchester, England. In 975 Common Era, Ethelwold publishes Regularis Concordia, which is a religious guidebook detailing the manner to conduct liturgical services, specifically on high religious holy days. So he publishes a book that says, here is how the service should be conducted. What's first, what's second, what's third, what's fourth, everything that should occur. In that publication, he added staging directions. And these are referred as tropes. So, tropes were an interpolation into the text. So, he gives stories, what's going to be told during these liturgical dramas, during liturgical services, and he adds staging directions or interpolations to the tropes that are being told. Now the staging, one, was simultaneous, meaning different locations within the performing space give rise to the use of mansions. Okay, I've talked about mansions when I talked about scenic design. Number 2, his staging was emblematic. Costumes and props were signs or symbols to communicate to the audience. So what Ethelwald would do is he'd have mansions, so we're on wheels, and different performances would be occurring at the same time. And the costumes and props that were being used were intended to be symbols or signs to talk directly to the audience, to communicate to the receivers what they're supposed to represent. And number 3, his staging was environmental, meaning it was performed wherever there was space. Okay? So, let's take a look at this. I think I've got that page number wrong. It's not page 210. Oh, I apologize. Where is... Vincennes? This is an outdoor stage at Vincennes. Vincennes is a place in France. Oh, why do I have the wrong page number? 280. That's why. I wrote 210 and it's supposed to be 280. So this image is on page 280 in your textbook. Here are 1, 2, 3 mansions at these that were built. So at each of these mansions, according to Ethelwald's staging, you would have simultaneous performances occurring that were depicting essentially different stories. So mystery plays were put together in cycles, with the cycles being performed in different communities and were known by the community's name. So here, this is the Vincennes cycle. Okay. Stages were set in the town squares, and mansions, individual scenic units, as you see here, were used for staging a religious drama, with one mansion for each play in the cycle. So if you have 3 stages like we see here, 3 mansions, then that's like a trilogy. That means the cycle is composed of those 3 stories. And as such, we would be performing one play within that cycle at each of these. Okay? I hope that makes a little bit of sense. Now, other areas developed wagon stages, which were low platform mounted on wheels in which scenery was moved on or off stage. Okay? Now, during this time, in each community, you had different guilds. Think today of a guild as a union. So these trade guilds existed. You had the silversmiths, the leather workers, the bakers, the carpenters. If these guilds belonged to religious organizations, then each guild would be responsible for producing an individual play in the cycle. So the Bakers Guild might be responsible for the Last Supper. The Carpenters Guild would be responsible for the story about Noah's Ark. So each union, each guild took a different story within a cycle. In England, only men performed, but in Europe, women could perform as well. Now, to organize the cycles in Valenciennes, it lasted 25 days. So you had performances going on for 25 days on those mansions. You would have a pageant master that supervised the preparations. Think of the pageant master as today's stage manager. Later on, platform stages were used as neutral spaces in which the imagination had to allow it to represent whatever the story needed. Okay? Now, in this photo, this image, here are our pageant wagons. So these stages are on wheels. You can see that. Different performances telling different stories within the cycle would occur on each one of these wagons, pageant wagons, as they're being pulled by the horses. You should think of pageant wagons as being the precursor from the medieval period to today's parades. The pageant wagons are what we call today's floats. So the next time you go to a parade, don't call them floats, call them pageant wagons. Now, medieval drama declined from religious themes due to a weakening of the church and the subsequent Protestant Reformation. And as a result, secular qualities of drama overcame the religious material, and the Renaissance developed. Secular dramas developed out of 1, street pageants, like today's parades, 2, the study of Roman plays in colleges and universities, 3, farces, where ordinary people made fun of domestic lives, and they made fun of things like infidelity and cuckoldry, and 4, morality plays that use classical gods and heroes rather than Christian ones. So the secular plays went back to the ideas that we saw in Greek theater primarily, but also some Roman theater. Our next 2 lectures are going to focus on Sophocles' play, and you need to have it read prior to the next lecture. Discussions, assignments, and quizzes will be given regarding the play and the lecture of Greek, Roman, and medieval theater, so that will also be coming. Now, one final comment on the ban. Theater was essentially banned for over 500 years, for sure, until we have the development of essentially liturgical theater. That's what we get with the morality, mystery, and miracle plays with Ethelwold and HROSWITHA. Theater as entertainment as we understand it today, however, was banned for 1,000 years. So, HROSWITHA and Ethelwold come into play during the 6th century, essentially. And they begin writing and developing liturgical works. That's not the theater that we understand it as today, as we think of it. With HROSWITHA writing approximately 500 years after the ban of theater in Rome. It's not until essentially the 1500s that theater and the development of the Renaissance, that theater as we think about and experience today is present. So, theater's banned in Rome. 500 years later, we get to medieval theater, which is essentially a focus on religious constructs and using theater ideas religiously. But 1,000 years after theater's banned in Rome is when theaters we understand today comes back into existence. I hope that makes sense to all of you. So, until next time, take care, everyone, and I'll see you in our next lecture about Antigone.